The sun had just begun to sink behind the jagged horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and bruised purples, when she stumbled across the open plain. Dust clung to her clothes and her heart pounded not just from the long ride, but from the terror that had driven her here. The wind carried a faint scent of smoke and iron, the signs of a world on the edge of something neither wholly civilized nor entirely wild. She glanced behind her, half expecting to see the shadow of the lawmenor, the men who had chased her from town, closing in with cruel intent. Her lips trembled as she whispered to herself, "Take her, not me." And yet, even as the words left her mouth, a chill told her that fate had other plans. The desert stretched endlessly, barren yet alive with its own harsh beauty. Every rock, every tuft of dry grass seemed to hum with stories of the past, stories of people who had fought and bled in silence. It was here, in this unforgiving land, that the Apache warrior had chosen to appear not as a phantom, but as a presence that could not be ignored. He was a figure of quiet strength, his eyes sharp and unreadable, moving with the kind of grace that suggested both danger and something almost sacred. The woman had seen warriors before, men who wore their pride like armor, but this one was different. He carried the weight of his people and the wilderness alike. Her mind raced, trying to remember the last clear moment before everything spiraled into chaos. The town had been bustling, almost painfully ordinary. Families gathered on porches, children chased one another along dusty streets, and she had been invisible, blending into the crowd. But that peace had shattered in the blink of an eye. Dispute over land, a careless insult, and then the shouting began. By the time she realized the danger, she was running, her steps frantic against the hard-packed earth, her breath ragged from fear. She had begged them, offered anything, anyone, just to save herself, but the world seemed deaf to her pleas. And then the Apache appeared. He had been watching, always watching, his presence like the shadow of a mountain looming over the valley. His face was calm, yet it carried the weight of countless battles, fought not all of them on the open plain. He moved with certainty, each step deliberate, and when he spoke, it was in a voice that seemed to rise from the land itself, low, commanding, almost hypnotic. She froze, unsure whether to flee or surrender, as he approached, his gaze fixed on her, as if he could see through her very soul. Fear clawed at her chest, but there was something else too, something harder to name. It was the strange sense that the world had tilted on its axis, that her life had been divided into a before and an after this moment. She had made a plea, one she thought would be heard, one that would spare her from the violence she knew was coming. "Take her, not me," she had begged, hoping her desperation would be enough to sway whatever sense of mercy existed in the man who held her fate. But there was no immediate answer, only the quiet hum of the desert around them, the wind brushing against the dry brush and carrying with it a promise of inevitability. The Apache did not respond in words at first. His eyes lingered on her, assessing, weighing, reading something deeper than fear or survival. In the pause, time seemed to stretch and twist. She noticed the way the fading light played across his features, sharp and angular, a face carved as if by the desert itself. She noticed the stillness of his hands, the way he held himself like the land itself had molded him. And yet, even as she tried to steady her shaking limbs, she sensed that the choice she had prayed for, the one that would save her at another's expense, was not something he would grant easily. Around them, the desert seemed to breathe. Cacti stood like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long and thin across the sand. A distant hawk cried out, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the tension building between them. She could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and uneven, and in that rhythm, she felt the impossible weight of the moment. Survival, she realized, was not merely about running or hiding. It was about understanding, about finding a thread to cling to in a world that had no mercy for weakness. The woman had seen stories, tales passed down from travelers and old folk who whispered of the Apaches and their warriors. They spoke of strength, of honor, of the bond between man and land. But she had never imagined meeting one herself, let alone at the threshold of her own despair. And now here he stood, silent, imposing, as if the desert itself had sent him to decide her fate. Her voice caught in her throat, her plea lingering in the air like a fragile hope. She had imagined surrender, imagined pleading, imagined being taken away and left behind, but she had not imagined what came next. The silence stretched, the kind that makes the skin crawl and the mind race. Then, a subtle movement to shift in his stance. A slight tilt of his head told her that the world had shifted in ways she could not yet comprehend. Something had changed, though she could not yet name it. She wanted to step back, to put distance between herself and the inevitability she felt. But every instinct told her to stay, to watch, to wait. It was as if the very air around them had thickened, filled with an energy that was both dangerous and mesmerizing. And then, in the quiet that followed, she understood. Her plea had been heard, but it had not been answered in the way she had hoped. The Apache's eyes met hers with a depth that unsettled her, and she felt, with a cold certainty, that neither she nor the other had been chosen to escape. The ground beneath them seemed to hold its breath, the shadows of the evening stretching long and thin, as if the land itself knew the story was far from over. She wanted to cry out, to resist, to bargain, but the words would not come. All she could do was stare, suspended in a moment that felt eternal, caught between fear and a strange, unnameable awe. The desert around them whispered of stories untold, of lives intertwined in ways that had yet to unfold. The sun dipped lower, casting the horizon in a fiery glow that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. She felt the cold bite of dread mixed with the strange thrill of witnessing something beyond her comprehension. Here, on this open plain, far from the comforts of town and civilization, she realized that her life had become a story she had not chosen to write. And yet, even in that recognition, there was a pulse of hope, fragile and fleeting, as if the land itself promised that the tale was far from over. She did not move when he stepped closer, did not try to flee, though every fiber of her being screamed in protest. The Apache's presence was absolute, commanding, and she could feel the weight of his decision pressing down upon her. And in that instant, she knew the truth she had been trying to deny. This encounter was not about mercy, nor about simple survival. It was about something far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more inevitable. The wind carried the faint rustle of movement from the distant canyon, and she turned her head briefly. Sensing that the story of her life, and the lives of those she had tried to protect, were about to collide with forces she could not yet see. Her pulse raced, her thoughts spun, and yet she stood, rooted to the ground by a mixture of fear and fascination. The Apache had come not to negotiate, not to listen, but to act, and she understood with a sinking heart that the choices she had imagined were illusions. In that moment, with the last light of day bleeding across the desert, she whispered once more, a silent plea, not for herself, but for what she could not yet save. Take her, not me, she thought, and then realized the bitter truth. The desert, the warrior, the world itself had plans beyond her imagining. The wind shifted, carrying with it the first hints of what was to come. And she felt the inexorable pull of fate, knowing that the next step, the next moment, would change everything. And then it happened. The warrior moved, swift and silent, as if the land itself had lent him its power. She braced herself, expecting one outcome, one mercy, one reprieve, but the desert had its own story to tell, and the Apache its own code to follow. In the blink of an eye, everything she thought she knew about survival, about fear, about choice, was turned upside down. She could only gasp, her voice lost in the wide, unforgiving plain, as she realized that neither her plea nor her hope could alter the path that fate had chosen. The evening settled, heavy with shadow and unspoken tension. Somewhere in the distance, the call of a coyote broke the silence, sharp and lonely. And she stood there, heart pounding, mind racing, knowing that the story was just beginning, and that the next moment would hold the answer she both feared and longed for. The desert watched, the wind whispered, and the Apache warrior moved, carrying with him the weight of the land, the people, and the choices no one else could understand. She could only wait, trapped between hope and dread, as the horizon darkened and the night promised that nothing would ever be the same again. The night came fast, wrapping the desert in a velvet black that swallowed everything but the faint shimmer of stars. She could feel the cold creeping into her bones, the harsh wind cutting across her face as the silence pressed in from all sides. The Apache warrior did not speak, did not shift his expression, and yet she felt the weight of his presence like a physical force. Every instinct told her to run, but she had nowhere to go. The plains stretched endlessly, and the shadows of distant mesas seemed to leer like silent sentinels. In the distance, the flicker of firelight hinted at a campsite, though it was impossible to tell if it was friend or foe. She knew then that her life had been set on a course she could not steer, guided by hands that were stronger, older, and far more certain than her own. She had spent days running before this encounter, and in those hours she had learned a hard truth. The world did not wait for pleas or prayers. Every step had been measured against hunger, thirst, and the constant threat of men who wanted what she had or what she represented. The town she had fled had its own rules, and the people who enforced them were merciless. They did not care for her cries, nor for the dangers that surrounded her. Survival, she had discovered, was not granted it, was wrested from a world that did not care. Her mind wandered back to the moments before she had fled. The argument in the town square had been sudden, a spark that ignited a powder keg of old grudges. She had not intended to be caught in it, not intended to be swept into a storm she barely understood. But the moment the guns had come out, and the shouts had pierced the air, she had realized that her only choice was flight. She had abandoned everything familiar, her home, the small comforts, even the people she loved, to escape the men who would not hesitate to take what they wanted. And now, faced with the silent, unyielding figure of the Apache, she understood that escape was far more complicated than she had imagined. He had appeared like a shadow in the twilight, moving with the ease of a predator who knew the land as well as he knew himself. His skin was bronzed and lined by sun and wind, his body strong but lean, honed by countless years of life in the open. She could not tell how old he was, only that he carried an authority that seemed to come from the land itself. Every movement was purposeful, every glance measured. It was not cruelty in his eyes, nor malice, but a knowledge of things that went beyond her understanding. She realized that her desperation, her plea, even her life itself, meant little in the face of a man like him. Yet she could not look away. There was something magnetic about him, something terrifying and alluring all at once. She felt like a small figure caught in the orbit of a force she could neither resist nor fully comprehend. And as the firelight from the distant camp flickered across his face, she glimpsed a hint of expression, a flash of something human, buried beneath layers of discipline and distance. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it unsettled her, made her wonder what had shaped the man who now held her fate. The Apache did not speak, but she sensed his awareness. He could feel her fear, her hesitation, her faint hope that somehow she could bargain her way out. Perhaps he saw her heart raw and unguarded, and measured it against his own code of honor. Perhaps he did not care at all, and his silence was simply the way of the land, unflinching and absolute. She could not be sure, and the uncertainty gnawed at her like a hidden predator, always just out of reach. She thought of the town she had left behind, of the people who would not understand why she had fled, and of the child she had hoped to protect. Her mind twisted with questions that had no answers. Was the Apache here to punish, to protect, or to claim something she could not yet see? She had no way of knowing, and the desert offered no comfort. Only the wind, the cold, and the endless stretch of sand and stone, as if the world itself were holding its breath for what would come next. Her thoughts drifted to her own past, to the life that had once seemed so simple. She had been young, naive, in ways she had not understood, believing in rules and fairness, in the quiet rhythm of a world where effort and morality brought rewards. But those illusions had shattered long ago. The people of the town were capable of cruelty. The world was capable of betrayal. She had learned that survival required more than courage. It required cunning, intuition, and the willingness to face dangers she could not even name. The Apache, in his silent, commanding way, embodied all of that and more. She tried to read him, to anticipate his next move, but it was impossible. He was a figure molded by forces she could not see. The land, his people, the burdens of a history she had never known. Every instinct she had told her to flee, yet every part of her knew that escape was meaningless unless she understood him, lest she could anticipate his choices and survive the consequences. And in that realization, fear and fascination collided, leaving her feeling fragile, exposed, and utterly dependent on a man she barely understood. The firelight from the distant camp grew brighter as the night deepened, suggesting the presence of others, though who they were remained a mystery. She sensed movement around them, the subtle shift of the desert, the rustle of unseen creatures, and perhaps the careful watching of eyes hidden in the darkness. Everything was heightened. The sound of her own breath, the feel of the wind against her skin, the faint trembling of the earth beneath her feet. The tension pressed down like a living thing, binding her to the place, to the moment, to the inevitability that had brought her here. She thought of the people she had tried to protect, of the promises she had whispered in the night before running, and of the choices she had made to survive. Every decision had led her. Here and now, she stood at the edge of something she could not control. The Apache was not just a man. He was a force, a presence tied to a history she did not know, and a land she had never fully understood. And as the firelight flickered across his features, she realized that the story of her life was no longer hers to tell. It belonged to the desert, to the warrior, and to the inevitable unfolding of events that she could not yet see. Memories of the past haunted her, fleeting images of laughter and safety, of quiet afternoons and warm fires, of family and the faint comfort of routine. Those moments felt distant now, almost unreal, swallowed by the desert and the danger that loomed over her. She clung to them in memory, not because they could help her, but because they reminded her that she had once known a world different from this one, a world that had rules, or at least the illusion of them. The Apache belonged to another world, one older, harsher, and untamed, and she could only glimpse its edges, feeling both awe and terror at what she saw. She shivered as the wind shifted, carrying a scent of smoke and wood from the distant fire. The sound of night creatures, coyotes, owls, and smaller animals scuttling unseen, filled the spaces around them, a chorus that emphasized her isolation. She realized with a sinking heart that she could not predict what was coming, could not negotiate with a force she barely understood, and could not rely on the illusions of safety that had once comforted her. All she could do was watch, wait, and prepare herself for whatever would come next. The Apache's eyes never left her, steady and unyielding, as if he could see the thoughts racing through her mind. And in that gaze, she felt both judged and protected, threatened and strangely understood. It was a contradiction that unsettled her, leaving her unsure whether to trust, to fight, or to surrender entirely. She realized that the night ahead would test everything she knew about courage, fear, and the limits of human endurance. The desert, the warrior, and her own desperate hope had created a crucible from which there would be no easy escape. She took a tentative step, then another, her movements careful, aware that every gesture could carry meaning, that every sound could shift the balance of power. The Apache remained still, silent but fully present, and the tension between them stretched into the night like the endless desert shadows. She knew the coming hours would demand everything she had, her strength, her wit, her heart, and perhaps even more than she thought possible. The night was far from over, and the story of her life, intertwined now with the warrior in the desert, had only just begun. The wind whispered across the plains once more, carrying with it the faint promise of danger, discovery, and decisions that could not be undone. She could feel the desert watching, the stars burning cold and distant above, and the weight of the Apache's presence pressing down like a living force. And in that moment, she understood the truth. Her fate was no longer hers to control. The path ahead was fraught with choices she might never fully understand. The night stretched on, deep, dark, and endless, holding its secrets close, while the firelight in the distance flickered like the pulse of something waiting, always waiting, just beyond reach. Her heart beat faster, her mind raced, and the desert held its breath as the Apache moved with a slow, deliberate step, signaling that the first chapter of their story was about to unfold and that nothing would ever be the same again. The night had grown colder, the stars sharp points of ice in the endless sky. When she finally allowed herself to breathe, though every inhale carried the taste of fear, the Apache had not moved far, but his presence seemed to occupy the entire desert. She felt it in the stillness of the air, in the way the sand whispered under her boots, and in the distant, haunting cry of an unseen coyote. The tension was not just between them. It was in the land itself, in the shadows that stretched across the plain, in the uncertain dark that promised both danger and revelation. She realized that her life had become a story she could not predict, one where every choice mattered but none of them were entirely hers. Her thoughts returned to the town she had fled. It had been a place of quiet familiarity, the kind that makes people complacent until chaos erupts. She had once believed that rules, decency, and common sense could protect her. But those illusions had shattered the moment she had been forced to run. The people she had known, the streets she had walked, the faces she had trusted, they were all part of a world that offered no sanctuary for weakness. The Apache was proof of another truth. Survival did not come from pleading or bargaining. It came from understanding forces larger than oneself, from reading intentions in shadows, from anticipating moves that were invisible to the ordinary eye. As she watched him, she noticed small things, details she had not before. The way his fingers flexed with readiness, the slight shift of his weight as he scanned the horizon, the subtle way his eyes lingered on the distant fire before returning to her. Each motion told a story, one of discipline, of training, and of the silent burden he carried as part of a people bound to the land. She wondered what had forged him into the man who now held her fate, what battles he had fought, what losses he had endured, and what promises he had kept to survive in a world that was always unforgiving. She shivered, partly from cold, partly from the weight of her thoughts. She had tried to protect someone once, long before this flight, and she had failed. That memory clouded her now, an echo of helplessness she could not silence. She had promised safety, and yet she had been powerless to deliver it. And now, here on this open plain with the Apache watching, she feared that the pattern would repeat. Her life had become a series of choices between bad and worse, and the stakes had never felt higher. The fire from the distant camp flickered again, drawing her gaze. She wondered about the people who sat around it, what they thought of the desert night, of the danger that might be lurking unseen. Were they hunters or travelers, allies or enemies? Could they be trusted, or would they see her as a prize to be taken, just as she feared the lawmen might? Each possibility twisted her stomach into knots, and yet she could not look away. The light was a promise of warmth, perhaps even safety, but also a reminder that the world was bigger than her fear, and that she was caught in its currents. The Apache finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate, almost blending with the wind. She flinched at first, unused to hearing words from someone who had seemed so much a part of the landscape itself. "Why do you run?" he asked, not accusing, not demanding, but curious in a way that unsettled her. She wanted to answer, to tell him the story of the town, the men, the chase, but the words felt fragile. Too small against the weight of the moment. She swallowed, searching for a way to explain herself without sounding weak, without giving him reason to dismiss her as helpless. "I had no choice," she said finally, her voice tight but clear. They would have taken everything." The sentence hung in the air, unfinished, because she could not fully name the terror she had felt. The Apache did not respond immediately, only tilted his head slightly, listening to the desert as much as to her words. She realized that speaking was not enough. He needed to understand her, to see her as more than a frightened woman. And yet she wondered if understanding was even possible, if he could comprehend the life she had known before this night, or if he judged it through a lens of survival far harsher than her own. The night pressed on, filled with the rustle of sand, the occasional cry of a distant animal, and the subtle movement of the warrior. She noticed the way he scanned the horizon, the way he seemed to measure the land, the firelight, and perhaps even her. There was an intelligence in his motion, a calculation born of years living in the unforgiving expanse. She tried to imagine his world, a life shaped by the desert, by loyalty to his people, by battles fought both seen and unseen. The contrast between his experience and her own was dizzying. She had known fear, but he had lived it, molded it, and transformed it into something she could barely begin to understand. Her mind wandered to the others he might be connected to. The camp in the distance was a clue, but not enough. Did he belong to a larger group, or was he a lone figure, a solitary force like the desert itself? She tried to imagine the stories that might accompany him, whispered legends among travelers, warnings given to outsiders, tales of strength and vengeance. And she realized that her encounter with him was not accidental. It was inevitable, drawn together by threads she could not see. She thought about the man she had hoped to protect before she fled, the person who had made her life in town feel tolerable. Fear gripped her heart again at the thought of what might happen to them now, alone in the hands of the world she had left behind. And yet she knew that the desert did not allow distraction, did not forgive divided attention. Survival demanded focus, demanded awareness, demanded that she reckon with the Apache, with the land, and with herself in a way she had never done before. The wind shifted again, and she caught a faint scent of smoke, mingled with the earthy, dry odor of the desert night. She realized that the fire from the distant camp was closer than it seemed, and that the people gathered there might move before dawn, their intentions unknown. Every sense was heightened: the crunch of sand underfoot, the whisper of wind through the brush, the faint, rhythmic pulse of the warrior's steps as he circled, as if marking territory she could not yet comprehend. She had never felt so exposed, so aware that each heartbeat was a fragile thread holding her to life. Her thoughts drifted again to the town and the life she had left behind. Faces, voices, streets, and buildings, fragments of a world that seemed distant and unreal now. She wondered if anyone had even noticed her absence, or if her story had already been rewritten by rumor and assumption. The Apache's presence made her feel simultaneously seen and invisible. He judged her not by the town's standards, but by the harsher, quieter standards of the land. She realized that the way forward required understanding that perspective, though she had no idea how to step into it without losing herself completely. Hours passed. The night deepened. The desert seemed alive, shifting, whispering, and testing her in ways she could barely grasp. She tried to anticipate the Apache's next move, tried to read the subtle signs in his posture and expression, but every instinct proved inadequate. She understood only one thing with clarity: nothing would happen according to her plan. Nothing would resolve simply, and every choice she made would carry consequences she could not yet see. The firelight flickered again, closer now, illuminating the rough shapes of tents, bundles, and figures moving quietly. She realized that the camp was more than a destination. It was a threshold, a point where the story of her flight and the story of the Apache might finally converge. And yet, even with its presence, she felt no relief. The desert held secrets, and the warrior carried codes she had not yet learned. She was caught between worlds: the fragile, familiar world she had fled, and the harsh, untamed world into which she had been thrust. Her heart pounded as she took a cautious step forward. Then another, each movement deliberate, aware that one wrong gesture could change everything. The Apache's eyes followed her, steady, unyielding, and full of silent judgment. She realized that he was testing her in his own way, that the silence and stillness were part of a ritual she could not yet understand. And in that moment, she accepted that the desert, the warrior, and her own fate were intertwined in ways that defied logic or hope. The night stretched endlessly, heavy with uncertainty, alive with the unseen eyes of the desert. She felt every heartbeat, every gust of wind, every whisper of sand, as though the world were conspiring to teach her a lesson she could not yet name. The Apache remained a presence larger than life, a force beyond reckoning, and she understood that the story of survival, fear, and unexpected connection had only begun to unfold. Every shadow carried threat or promise. Every movement might signal danger or opportunity. Every choice weighed heavily, and she realized that the next steps she took would shape the rest of her life, though she could not yet know how. The night was far from over, and the desert, the camp, and the Apache held mysteries she would have to confront, unravel, and survive. She swallowed hard, bracing herself against the wind, the cold, and the unknown. Knowing that the story had only deepened, that the conflict had only grown, and that every heartbeat carried her closer to a fate she could not yet see and might not survive. The wind grew colder as the night deepened, carrying the scent of smoke from the distant camp and the faint temps of desert sand. Every step she took toward the flickering fire made her feel exposed, yet compelled, as if some invisible thread had drawn her forward. The Apache warrior moved beside her, silent, his presence more commanding than any words could convey. She could feel the taut muscles beneath his skin, the way he adjusted his weight with effortless precision, as if the desert itself were an extension of him. Every movement was deliberate, every glance measured. She wanted to ask him why, to understand why she had been caught in this storm of fear and power, but the words lodged in her throat. The camp came into view, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across the sand and the rocky outcrops. Figures moved quietly among the tents, some hunched over fires, others standing watch, eyes scanning the horizon with vigilance. She realized that these people were no ordinary travelers or settlers. They carried a presence born of the wild, of a life forged on survival, of a connection to the land that made the desert itself seem alive in their company. The Apache's hand hovered near his weapon, not threatening her, but as if reminding her hand, perhaps himself, of the fine line that separated safety from chaos. Her heart thumped in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to step back, to flee, but the desert offered no sanctuary. The Apache's silence pressed down, as though the night itself had taken form in his stillness. She wondered what had brought him here, to this camp, to this moment. Did he belong to these people, or was he alone in his vigilance? Could they be trusted? Or was the firelight a trap, luring her into danger she could not yet imagine? Questions tumbled through her mind, each one heavier than the last, each one unanswered. She caught a glimpse of a child huddled near the fire, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the night chill. The sight tugged at something deep within her, a reminder of the vulnerability she had carried across the plains. The responsibility she had once borne, the promises she had whispered in fear and hope. She had begged the world to spare her, to spare them. But now she realized that the universe had its own plan, one she could not negotiate, one she could not bargain with. The Apache had chosen a path, and she was compelled to follow, even as fear and awe clashed within her. The wind shifted again, bringing with it the faint echo of voices, low and urgent, and the subtle clatter of metal. She flinched, unsure if the sounds were threats or warnings, but the Apache's gaze remained unbroken. He seemed to absorb every detail, the firelight reflecting in his eyes, sharp and unyielding. She realized with a sinking heart that he was not merely a protector or an observer, he was the arbiter of what would come. And her survival depended on reading the unspoken rules he carried like armor. She tried to remember her lessons from the town, from the streets and alleys she had once walked, from the people who had seemed to matter. But those memories felt distant and fragile now, shadows of a life she could not return to. Here in the desert, among the campfires and the watchful eyes, she understood that everything she had known about trust, safety, and control was meaningless. Survival demanded more than courage. It demanded understanding, quick thinking, and a willingness to accept the power that others wielded. And the Apache was the living embodiment of that power. As they drew closer, one of the figures at the camp stirred, stepping from the shadows to meet them. He was older, wiry, with lines etched deep into his face, and his eyes held the careful scrutiny of someone who had seen too much to be surprised. He regarded her for a long moment, then turned his attention to the Apache, speaking in a low, deliberate tone she could not understand. She could feel the tension between them, the unspoken exchange, the weight of histories and promises carried in every glance. Her pulse quickened. She had no idea what had been said, but the atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as if a decision long delayed was about to be made. The child near the fire stirred, crying softly, and she wanted to rush forward to offer comfort, but the Apache's hand on her arm held her still. She realized he had anticipated her instinct, understood it, and chose restraint over confrontation. The gesture was subtle but commanding, a reminder that he controlled more than just the desert around them. He controlled the immediate fate of everyone in this fragile, precarious circle. She felt the weight of his authority pressing down, a force she could neither resist nor fully grasp. The older man's words came again, slower this time, and the Apache responded with the same measured calm. She could not understand the language, but the tone, the rhythm, and the pauses told her everything she needed to know. A decision was being negotiated, a balance tested, a path uncertain. She felt the tension coil inside her like a live wire, each heartbeat echoing against the unspoken danger surrounding them. She had no control here. Every choice, every hesitation was observed and weighed, and the night, deep and unforgiving, seemed to lean closer, listening, waiting. She noticed the younger members of the camp now, their faces half hidden in shadow, their eyes wide and cautious. They were the same age as she had been when she first learned to measure fear and hope together. She wondered what their stories were, what paths had brought them here, and whether they would survive the night that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Their presence reminded her that this world was full of hidden lives, each one shaped by necessity, by loyalty, and by the unforgiving land. And she realized that she, too, had become part of that story, no longer an outsider, no longer a witness, but a participant in a drama larger than herself. The Apache finally spoke, his words low, deliberate, carrying a weight that made her flinch. She could not understand the meaning, but she felt it deep in her chest, the authority, the command, the promise that his decisions were not made lightly. And when he looked at her, there was an intensity she could not ignore. A silent insistence that she trust, that she move forward, that she accept her place in the unfolding events. Her breath caught in her throat, and she realized that her fear was no longer just for herself. It was for the lives entwined with hers, for the people in the camp, for the fragile threads holding this night together. The firelight flickered again, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and stretch toward them, pulling the desert into a living tableau. She felt the presence of danger everywhere and seen, almost intangible but palpable, pressing against her skin and settling in her chest. She knew the Apache felt it too. She could see it in the subtle tightening of his jaw, in the alert shift of his stance, in the way his eyes scanned the horizon even as they returned to her. The night had become a crucible, testing endurance, courage, and the fragile balance between life and the unknown. Suddenly, a sound sharp, metallic, like the clash of tools or weapons, shattered the stillness. The child screamed, and she instinctively moved to protect them, only to feel the Apache's hand steady her. He did not speak, but the gesture was enough. The danger was real, immediate, and required patience, not rash action. She felt her own pulse quicken, the desert night pressing down with relentless intensity, and realized that every second now carried weight. Every movement could tip the fragile balance between survival and disaster. She glanced around the camp again, noting the shadows among the tents, the careful placement of fires, the subtle signals exchanged among the people. The older man had retreated slightly, his expression unreadable, while the younger members whispered and shifted, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. The Apache remained her anchor, steady and unflinching. But even he could not fully control the unknown forces gathering in the darkness. She realized then that the night had become a test of endurance, perception, and courage, a moment that would define everything to come. Her mind spun with questions. Who were these people, truly? What had drawn them here, to this place, to this moment? And why had the Apache chosen her path to intersect with theirs? Every instinct screamed danger, yet some small part of her heart whispered hope that perhaps, in this perilous convergence, there was a chance for understanding, for survival, for something beyond fear. But the desert held its secrets tightly. The firelight revealed only fragments, and the shadows seemed to conceal threats that would strike without warning. She felt the weight of the night pressing closer, the wind carrying whispers and hints of movement, and the Apache's eyes never left her. She understood with a sudden clarity that the coming hours would demand everything she had: courage, intelligence, endurance, and trust in a man whose decisions she could not predict. The firelight, the shadows, the child, the people in the camp, all of it was a puzzle, a delicate balance she had been thrust into without consent. And as the sounds of the desert deepened, carrying the faint rustle of creatures and the whisper of wind through the rocks, she realized that the climax of this long night, the moment when fear, fate, and human will collided, was approaching, inevitable and unavoidable. The Apache shifted, subtle and controlled, signaling a readiness she could feel as keenly as she could feel the desert chill. Every hair on her body stood on end. The camp, the fires, the distant hills all seemed to lean closer, holding their breath, waiting for the storm that was coming. She had no choice now but to follow, to trust the instinct and judgment of a man whose world she barely understood, move toward a confrontation she could neither predict nor escape. The night was alive with danger, anticipation, and an energy that made her feel both small and vital. And then, from somewhere deeper in the shadows, came a sound that made her blood run cold, the faint, deliberate crunch of footsteps, not part of the camp, not part of the familiar desert rhythm. She froze, heart hammering, as the Apache's eyes narrowed, his body taut with readiness. The firelight caught the edge of something glinting in the distance, and a shiver ran down her spine. The moment had arrived. The night was about to erupt, and the desert, the warrior, and all the lives caught in this fragile circle were poised on the knife edge of what was coming next. The desert held its breath as the approaching footsteps grew louder, each crunch of sand striking her nerves like a drum. The Apache's body tensed beside her, his eyes fixed on the shadows where movement twisted and flickered, and she felt a wave of fear that threatened to swallow her whole. Yet she did not move. She had learned, through the long night, that survival sometimes demanded stillness, patience, and trust in the instincts of those who truly knew the land. From the darkness, two figures emerged, cautious but deliberate. Their eyes wide at the sight of the camp, the firelight, and the lone woman standing beside the Apache. They were outsiders, she realized, travelers or perhaps men seeking something lost or stolen in the wild expanse. Their voices were low, tense, but she could not hear the words, only the urgency, the anxiety that radiated from their movements. The Apache stepped slightly forward, his presence commanding, and in an instant the desert seemed to sharpen, every shadow and detail made sharper by the unspoken warning in his stance. The younger of the two outsiders stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, and the sound carried like a flare across the still night. The Apache's eyes narrowed, his hand moving subtly toward the weapon at his side, but not in haste. He moved with a calm certainty, a rhythm born of long practice, as if he and the desert had rehearsed this moment countless times. She could feel the tension coil in the air, a living thing pressing against her skin and making her pulse race. Understood that whatever happened next would decide not only her fate, but the balance of this fragile, impermanent gathering. Suddenly, the older outsider raised a hand, pointing toward her, his voice sharp and demanding. She felt a flicker of panic, the same instinct that had driven her across the desert in flight. But the Apache's presence was grounding, steadying her in a way she had never experienced. His gaze met hers, silent and commanding, and she knew without doubt that he would protect her, though not out of kindness or sentiment, out of a code, a principle forged in blood and survival. She felt a strange mixture of fear and gratitude, understanding that life in the desert was never simple, and mercy was measured differently here. The outsiders hesitated, glancing between her and the Apache, as if sensing that the moment demanded more than threats or force. The child near the fire had started to cry again, and her heart clenched at the sound. She wanted to step forward to comfort them, but the Apache's hand rested lightly on her arm, keeping her still. The gesture was not gentle, not kind, but precise, instructive an unspoken lesson in restraint. She swallowed her fear and obeyed, realizing that survival often required waiting, watching, and letting the right moment come without rushing it. Time seemed to stretch, each second weighted with uncertainty. The desert night whispered around them, the distant hills cloaked in shadow, and the firelight flickered across faces filled with tension and caution. The Apache spoke at last, his voice low, measured, each word deliberate. Though she could not understand the language, she felt the authority, the intention, the command in it. The outsiders stiffened, as if the words carried a force they could not resist. She realized that this was not negotiation in the sense she had known in the town. It was the assertion of understanding, of territory, of boundaries that could not be crossed. Then, almost imperceptibly, the tension began to shift. The outsiders' rigid posture softened, their hands lowered, and the fear that had radiated from them slowly gave way to cautious compliance. The Apache did not relax, did not smile, but the change was unmistakable. He had asserted his control without bloodshed, without raising his voice, without a single false step. She felt a mix of awe and relief, the kind that comes from witnessing power wielded with precision and honor. The desert itself seemed to exhale, the night air settling around them as if acknowledging the resolution of the immediate danger. Her gaze returned to the child, and she knelt beside them, drawing the blanket closer to shield against the chill. The small fingers clutched hers, and she felt a bond, fragile but real, form in that shared moment of vulnerability. The Apache watched quietly, allowing her this connection, and she realized that his protection was not just physical, but also a permission, a recognition that human connection mattered even in the harsh, unyielding desert. She allowed herself a brief sense of hope, fragile but undeniable, and knew that the night's trials had taught her lessons that would endure far longer than any fear she had carried. The older man from the outsiders group approached slowly, his eyes cautious, and spoke again. She could not understand the words, but the tone was different now, quieter, respectful, and perhaps tinged with understanding. The Apache responded, his stance still commanding, yet his movements precise and controlled. She realized that communication in the desert was more than words, it was presence, posture, intention, and a rhythm that dictated trust and obedience. She felt the threads of fear untangle slightly, replaced by a tentative understanding that the night's danger had been averted, though not without its lessons. The fire crackled, the child's crying subsided, and the desert seemed to hold a softer, almost watchful presence around the small camp. She finally allowed herself to look at the Apache fully, seeing not just the warrior, but the man shaped by the desert, by history, and by choices that had demanded strength, clarity, and sometimes ruthlessness. She understood, in a way she could not have before this night, that courage was measured differently here. It was in knowing when to act, when to wait, and how to balance survival with compassion, even if only in small gestures. Hours passed slowly as the night carried them forward, the outsiders eventually retreating to the shadows, leaving the camp to settle. The Apache moved quietly, checking the perimeter, the fires, and the people within his care, ensuring safety without fanfare. She followed, aware now that every step she took, every movement, was part of the rhythm of this harsh land. Part of the lesson she had been forced to learn, that survival was not merely about escape, but about understanding, observation, and trust. She thought of the town she had fled, of the people she had left behind, and of the life that had seemed so ordinary and predictable. Those memories no longer felt like a refuge but a distant world, fragile and unreal compared to the intensity of the desert night. Here, she had learned the rules of a different life, the weight of presence, the power of restraint, the meaning of decisions that shaped not just one life, but the fragile network of those around her. The Apache had shown her a path, though she did not yet know how far it would take her or what challenges remained. By the first hints of dawn, the desert began to soften, the sky turning pale shades of orange and pink. The camp was quiet now, the fires reduced to glowing embers, and the people within it moving with careful purpose. She felt exhaustion in her bones, but also a quiet growing strength, as if the night's trials had instilled something deeper than fear, resilience. The child slept in her arms, and she felt a sense of accomplishment, however small, in having reached this fragile dawn without catastrophe. The Apache finally spoke to her in a few deliberate words, slow and measured. She could not understand the language, but the tone conveyed approval, acknowledgement, and perhaps a measure of respect. She realized then that the night had been a test, not just of survival, but of character, courage, and the willingness to adapt. The desert, harsh and indifferent, had been a crucible, and she had endured. The warrior had judged her not by what she had said or done before, but by how she had carried herself in the immediacy of danger, and that had determined her place in the night's outcome. The sun climbed higher, casting warm light across the desert and revealing the rugged beauty of the land, mesas, cacti, and the vast open plains that had seemed so threatening in the dark. She took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs with clarity and relief. The night's fear still lingered, but it had transformed into something more enduring: knowledge, understanding, and a connection to a world she had never fully known. The Apache remained beside her, a silent guardian, his eyes scanning the horizon, even as the danger had faded, and she felt gratitude that transcended words. The camp stirred to life, the people moving with purpose, tending fires and gathering supplies. She realized that their stories were far longer, far more complex than she could ever hope to understand, and yet they had allowed her a place among them, fragile and tentative as it might be. She understood that survival was not only about strength or fearlessness, but about understanding the rhythms of the world and the people who inhabited it, about finding a place within a larger story that could shape, protect, and transform life itself. As the sun climbed higher, she felt a sense of completion, not in triumph, but in clarity. The night had tested her, taught her, and ultimately reshaped her understanding of courage, trust, and human connection. She looked at the Apache once more, recognizing not just the warrior, but the man whose presence had changed the course of her life. She understood that the desert had a way of revealing truths that towns and familiar streets could never teach, and that sometimes survival was inseparable from the choices and the wisdom of those who understood the land intimately. The child stirred again, reaching for her, and she smiled softly, feeling a quiet, enduring hope. The desert stretched out endlessly around them, beautiful, unforgiving, and alive. She knew that while danger might still lie ahead, the lessons of the night had given her strength. She had been tested, judged, and preserved, and she had learned to trust not blindly, but with awareness in the instincts, the decisions, and the honor of those who wielded power in a world where survival was never guaranteed. The sun rose fully, casting light across the desert, revealing the textures of sand, stone, and scrub. She felt the warmth seep into her bones, a balm after the long, tense hours of night. The Apache stood silently beside her, and in that quiet companionship, she recognized the bond forged in shared danger, in trust earned, and in the understanding that life in the desert required both courage and humility. The past, the fears, and the uncertainty of the night were still present, but they had become part of her story, part of the enduring lesson of survival, respect, and connection. And as the first full light of day spread across the plains, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that the night had passed, that the dangers had been faced, and that she had been given a chance not only to survive, but to understand the deeper truths of the land, the people, and the warrior who had changed the course of her life. The desert was still eternal, and full of stories yet to unfold, but she had learned the ways to navigate its challenges, and in that knowledge, she found a quiet strength that would endure long after the sun climbed high. The night was over, but its lessons, its tension, and its revelations would remain, shaping the choices, the courage, the life she was only beginning to reclaim. Her heart, once heavy with fear, now carried both hope and resolve. She had survived the desert, the unknown, and the test of the Apache's judgment. She had emerged wiser, stronger, and more aware in the world. Though still wild and unpredictable, felt a little more navigable with each step she took beside the warrior who had brought her through the longest night of her life.